I'm Bill Amos, and welcome to another edition of And Now the News. My guest this week is Sonia Furstenau, the leader of the BC Green Party. Thank you for coming on, Ms. Furstenau.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
You have been in the news lately because, well, not only because you're the leader of the Green Party, of course, but because you sort of had some nasty tweets thrown your way by some members of the media for, quote, attacking Bonnie Henry and the way that the pandemic has been managed in this province. So I wonder if you could tell us what's your main beef there?
I'm not attacking an individual. That is not how I approach things. I'm really looking at policy. We've gotten the message in the last briefing from government and from the provincial health office that we're kind of on our own now in COVID. There's very little data that's going to be released. It's now a weekly data. We know that there's very little testing that's happening, and so we don't have an accurate picture, and particularly not in real time, of the level of illness that we have in BC. What hasn't been conveyed clearly, and I think this is essential in any kind of public health approach, is how COVID is transmitted. It is an airborne virus. It is transmitted in the air. What are the most effective measures to personally protect yourself, but also for us to collectively protect ourselves? And that is around air. It's ventilation, it's filtration, it's making the air clean, and it's the use of really effective masks. And thirdly, there is very little information coming from the provincial health office and from the government about long COVID. And there was a study released last week that got some media attention, which indicated that looking at a wide range of studies on long COVID in children, it's currently 1 in 4 children, even with a mild case of COVID, that will experience symptoms for an extended time after their infection, whether it's a mild infection or a severe one. And in adults, the studies indicate it's between 10 and 30% of adults who are experiencing long-lasting symptoms, a wide variety: fatigue, brain fog, heart issues, lung issues, diabetes onset. And I think that what we really need in terms of the expectation from our government and the public health approach to this is a really clear communication strategy so that people understand both how this virus is transmitted and how to protect yourself, but also that for a lot of people, it's not an infection and then you're done with it, like a cold or a flu, that it can lead to these long-lasting symptoms. The Financial Times had a piece last week about the implications of long COVID on the economy, and that the number of people who are unable to return to work because of long COVID is having direct impacts, and in the future will have increasing impacts on the health of the economy. So I think there's a lot that we have been lacking in how this government and PHO have communicated about COVID.
It seems that there have been many, if you like, many bumps along the way, going back to the initial announcement of what the school strategy in schools was going to be. A lot of people, a lot of parents, a lot of teachers were quite upset that masks were not made mandatory for quite a long time in the school system. And now here we are again at a point where it's no longer mandatory to wear masks for kids from K to 12. Do you think that's been a major problem?
We've certainly heard from a lot of people in the wake of the decision to remove the mask mandate who are really concerned whether they have children who are immunocompromised, whether they have family members who are immunocompromised, because it's not just the fact that masks are no longer required in schools or in any public setting. It's that in combination with that, there's no information coming out about the level of infection or virus in our schools, in our communities. And so people are really concerned about the fact that they have to be making health decisions for themselves and their families and their loved ones, but they're doing that with a very limited amount of information upon which to make those decisions.
What do you,
I will say my kids are still wearing their N95s at school every day. And they report that it's about 30 to 40% of kids in their school continue to wear masks. I'm also hearing, I heard from a close friend last night, her daughter in grade 10, a third of the kids weren't at school yesterday. Unfortunately, we're operating with anecdotal information, yes, which is nowhere as important as data, but we have a vacuum of data. What is our collective goal here? How are we measuring success? How do we know if we're on the right track, if we aren't gathering data, if we aren't monitoring the levels of illness? It's a very sort of surprising place that I find that we're in right now, which is this combination of, as individuals, it's up to you to decide what measures you want to take and how much risk you're willing to expose yourself to. But we're going to really not provide you a lot of guidance or information in order to make informed choices. And if you think of other public health approaches, I think back, I grew up I was born in 1970. So the 1980s and 1990s, the HIV/AIDS crisis was certainly a very significant public health emergency. And what I recall so clearly was, as more and more became known about that virus, there was this enormous effort to educate the public. Here is how this disease is spread. It's spread through sexual contact. It's spread through sharing needles. Here are the measures that you can take to protect yourself. And so the whole notion of protected sex in the 1980s and 1990s, it wasn't wear a condom if you choose to. It was, this is how you protect yourself and other people. And that is an example of kind of a public health response rooted in education, rooted in providing the tools. I mean, condoms became widely and freely available as a measure to respond to this public health emergency. And I don't understand why we wouldn't be approaching this in the same way.
What about this aerosol issue? What do you think? What kind of policy should the government adopt in relation to this, do you think?
Yeah, I've just finished working on a piece about this, and the fascinating thing to me is that there are solutions, and they are implementable solutions. So number one, let's start with that recognition of aerosol transmission, that it's an airborne virus. So then, okay, the air is the issue here. So how do we make sure that air is as clean and safe as it possibly can be? Well, we know ventilation is a really effective approach to this. We know that where ventilation is harder to achieve, filtration, so HEPA filters, the Corsi-Rosenthal boxes are an example. We know that, opening a window. So moving that air through and cleaning that air is a fantastic way to diminish the amount of potential virus that's in the air. So we can even measure. So you measure CO2 levels, and that gives you an indication of how concentrated the CO2 is in the room, and that can then give you a guidance for how concentrated there might be if there's somebody in the room who is positive and asymptomatic. And then from there, there's new technology that's starting to emerge, the UV lights as a measure of further cleaning the air. So if you compare it to, say, cholera, And once the science became clear in the 19th century that cholera was a waterborne disease, the public health measure supported by governments was clean the water, right? We can reduce the burden of this disease in our society and in our communities by ensuring that government is investing in clean water, in good sanitation. We face the same thing here, which is we can be looking at what can government do. So set standards for air quality, for indoor air quality, and then provide incentives and support to businesses and institutions to reach those standards. Have people really understand, this comes back to the education piece, if you really understand that this is an airborne virus, then you know how to protect yourself more effectively in an area where you can't be certain of how safe the air is. You put on an N95 mask. In a situation where you might be, an asymptomatic carrier, you've been exposed to COVID, then you're going to take extra protective measures to protect people that you might be interacting with. Like there's a way of, it's not about like shutting down everything and everybody staying in their homes. We've learned enough about the virus and about the mitigation measures that we can actually take really concrete steps and get us to a place where we're not seeing this burden of wave after wave after wave.
A lot of people have been saying that it looks like the government has put the economy managing the economy ahead of trying to keep people safe during this pandemic. Do you think that's a valid argument?
Yeah, I'm going to go back. I'm just pulling up this Financial Times article. So this was printed April 9th. Less than a week ago.
Right.
And the name of the article is Long COVID, the Invisible Public Health Crisis Fueling Labor Shortages. And the article lays out, both the data as well as some anecdotal examples of, we know that there's a growing labor shortage. We know that there are real challenges. I mean, we have it right here in BC. The ferries have been canceling sailings because there aren't enough crew members to fill the spots that are needed to run those sailings. So we should be very mindful of this growing impact. And what the article lays out is that as we see a growing number of people with long COVID, we're going to be facing some potential real impacts to the economy because of labor shortages, because of people not being able to come back into the workforce after an COVID illness. And as we see these successive waves where so many people are, as you say, and I know some in my very close life who are having their second COVID infection of this year. With each successive wave, if we're just saying 10 to 30% of people are going to now be experiencing long COVID, we should be taking that seriously as a financial and economic concern, right? And then the other implication of, okay, what does this mean for the burden for our healthcare system if there are more and more people struggling with these long-term health effects? How are we looking ahead and taking into account not just the human cost, the toll on people and individuals and families and communities from that, but the collective cost to our healthcare system?
Mr. Horgan was saying on his first interview after recovering, he says, from COVID, that he had the sniffles and it wasn't a very major case. And while he says, yes, we should be conscious of the fact that COVID's still here, but you should get out there, enjoy BC. And that seems to be the overall message that he's putting out there.
One of the interesting things is to look at the trajectory of the 1918 flu pandemic. And it was, in fact, right at about the second year of the pandemic that people just grew weary of social distancing and masking and taking precautions. And it was at that point that the deadliest wave of the flu pandemic actually hit. There is a human nature aspect to this that I think is really important to try to understand. And in the past, I've called for an independent science table, like exists in Ontario. And we have the COVID-19 modeling group, we have the Protect Our Province group, and so these independent groups of health professionals and scientists have come together, and they are, providing information and data and guidance to people. I would like it to be recognized, the importance and the value of having independent scientists and experts. I also think it should include a sociologist, a psychologist, and a historian, because it's more than just looking, say, at epidemiology, or just through the lens of the medical kind of approach to this. We've needed from the beginning to really look at it as something that affects every aspect of our society, obviously, and that is also rooted in understanding the human nature and the response to these longer crises. So I was just thinking about this the other day. We are very good in emergencies. We're kind of wired as humans for emergencies, right? And you can see that, for example, in how governments can respond to something like the Coquihalla, the flooding and the impact to the Coquihalla. Okay, we're going to get out there. We're going to get our crews. We're going to rebuild that. That is an emergency response to something like that. What we're not particularly designed for is these longer term crises, and climate change is a really clear example of this. We're now responding to the emergencies of the weather events that climate change is driving, but we're still really struggling to respond to the actual crisis of climate change. And you see that in data and outcomes. Our emissions keep going up, right? So to me, that is the measure of, are we responding to climate change appropriately? No, we are not. We're responding to the emergencies, but not to what is causing those emergencies. And I think that what we're seeing with the pandemic is a kind of weariness, and I understand it, and I get it, and I feel it. But this is where leadership and public health has this very important role to play in being the kind of North Star, the guiding principle. What are we trying to achieve? How are we going to do that together? And I think that it should be agreed that we want to have less of this virus in our communities and in our society. That should be the goal, right? How do we suppress this? How do we keep the impacts of this minimal? How do we protect the most vulnerable? One of the figures coming out of Ontario is the rate of hospitalization of children right now. And I think if we had seen something like that in the first wave of COVID, that would have just cemented people's commitment to, like, we can't let children be hospitalized from this. And yet that's what's happening in Ontario right now.
Well, thank you very much, Sonia, for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I think you've made some very, very important points as to how, the approach should change toward the pandemic. So again, thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good week.
Thanks, Bill. It was a pleasure. Take care.
Yeah, you too.